Hello. Welcome to the last in a series of noon spring quarter lectures sponsored by the Associated Student Speakers Program. Our guest today is Dr. Franz Shurmann, Professor of History and Sociology at Cal, and he's been for 4 years Chairman for the Center of the Study for Chinese Studies at Cal, and recently visited North Vietnam, where he visited 2 provinces and had a long interview with Premier Pham Van Dong. He's the author of Ideology and Organization in Communist China, and he's the co-author, of Politics of Escalation in Vietnam. Also, for the past 3 years, he's worked both as a political activist and as an intellectual on the war. That gives you a pretty good idea of his background. Now, without any further ado, Dr. Franz Shurmann.
Since we have sort of the end of the semester in a small meeting, I'll make my remarks. Well, it's already 12, but maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion sort of at the end. One of the problems every speaker has in lecturing on a subject is that he tends to repeat himself. Now, this is, I think, the first time I've come down here. So a lot of what I've said now I had to say before, but when you give a talk like Report on North Vietnam, there are certain things that you saw, certain experiences that you had, and you do have to repeat them. I'd like to begin the lecture with some comments on what is perhaps the most striking thing to a visitor to North Vietnam, particularly as it was in my case while the bombing was still going on, namely the extraordinary capacity of this small country to have survived one of the most intensive aerial bombardments in world history. McNamara said about a year ago, and that was a year ago, that already more bombs had been dropped on North Vietnam than had been dropped on all of Europe and North Africa in World War II. And all of you have undoubtedly seen pictures of the destruction of German cities and other European cities during that war. How that that country has managed to survive. And the second thing, I'd like to say a few things about the Paris talks, some comments on them in the light of a fairly large number of conversations I had with officials in North Vietnam and leaders of the mission of the National Liberation Front in Hanoi. Now, let me, before I get into the North Vietnam part of the lecture, let me recall to you two debates that went on in military circles already in 1963, but particularly in 1964, which was the key year as far as the massive involvement of the United States in Vietnam is concerned. That up till 1964, particularly the Tonkin Gulf incident, that American involvement was still on a fairly small scale. There were only 16,000 Americans, military Americans in Vietnam as of the end of 1963. And when in May of 1964, President Johnson asked for the extraordinary sum then of $125 million for economic military aid to South Vietnam, this was considered a major escalation in American involvement. $125 million for a year, and actually a bit over a year of aid to South Vietnam at that time was nothing compared to what the war has been costing now, a minimum of $30 billion. So it was really in '64 that the that the large-scale involvement, or the beginnings of large-scale involvement, started, particularly with the Tonkin Gulf incident. Now, during that time, there not only was you might say, a struggle between two strategies that were being espoused, but also a considerable political and bureaucratic struggle, particularly between McNamara on the one hand and the military, more specifically the Navy and the Air Force, on the other hand. The controversy ranged over a whole series of things, of which Vietnam was only one part. In fact, the main substance of the controversy was whether U.S. defense should be based on missiles or manned aircraft. McNamara taking the position that it should be based on missiles, and he came out with a military program which in effect would have led to pretty much a phasing out of a large portion of the Air Force and the Navy by the early 1970s. So obviously the Navy and the Air Force weren't particularly interested in a defense program that was going to lead to their own disappearance. And the Navy and the Air Force countered with defense strategies which argued for heavy reliance on manned aircraft, that is to say ordinary bombers and fighters, things like battleships, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and so on, which McNamara had been vetoing. This fight was exceedingly intense. As intense, I suppose, as any, let's say, in a university of two departments fight, two departments of biochemistry in a kind of zero-sum game where if one wins, the other is simply disbanded. Obviously, it's a question of survival. Now, in this exceedingly acrimonious conflict, which finally last year led to the dismissal of McNamara, the Vietnam War played an important role. In fact, to state my own opinion, and I don't want to go into it now because that's a different lecture, I'll give it another time, that the Air Force and the Navy and a substantial segment of the American military discovered the Vietnam War. They were profoundly disinterested in that war earlier. In fact, in 1963, the U.S. military, I don't think, gave much consideration to the Vietnam War. They felt it was danger, was a waste of time, and as has been put in a number of books on the subject, they were a school that was called the Never Again School. And never again meant never again get involved in the war in the Asian mainland unless you can use nuclear weapons, which means if you can fight a war of last resort, but particularly don't send troops and don't get bogged down as you did in Korea. Well, the Never Again School melted away rather rapidly in '64, and the military became quite enthusiastic about the Vietnam War. I'll state my own conclusions as a result of my own research that I think they needed that war as a way of fighting this larger struggle with McNamara, and particularly to sabotage the ultimate effects of the Test Ban Treaty. In other words, they used the war essentially for internal bureaucratic political purposes, that their interest was not in the war as such. Of course, ultimately, when the involvement became so enormous, it did. Now, McNamara's strategy in regard to Vietnam, South Vietnam, was that the war has to be fought and won in South Vietnam itself. And it has to be fought on the ground. It has to be fought and won through pacification. It has to be fought and won through counterinsurgency. And in 1964, he even expanded some of his counterinsurgency notions to say, well, we can even fight and win this war by using a whole series of paramilitary programs which would exfiltrate special forces into Laos and into North Vietnam itself. In other words, we'll do the same thing that the communists have been doing. They send soldiers down the south and we'll send them up to the north. He launched a training program to train 50,000 South Vietnamese for exfiltration purposes, to send them into Laos as commandos, and lots of them were sent. In fact, there was probably more infiltration from the south to the north in those days than there was from the north to the south. The thing that the North Vietnamese have pointed out, and of course also adding with considerable pride that they succeeded in in destroying that whole wave of infiltration, which of course was not true in regard to the South. Now the Air Force and the Navy, they began developing the idea that the whole war could be fought and won with airstrikes by the bombing of North Vietnam. In fact, they were saying, let's not get bogged down in South Vietnam, let's just unleash our bombers on North Vietnam, and this war can be won in a short time. Curtis LeMay put it in a very trenchant way shortly after Kennedy's death when he said, we shouldn't be swatting flies, what we ought to do is get at the manure pile, which to him was a way of designating the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the North. Now McNamara, as far as I can see, was opposed to the bombing of the North for the rather simple reason that he was also building a military détente with the Soviet Union based on something that people have called the balance of terror or parity of weapon systems. And he was very much afraid that bombing the sovereign territory of a member of the socialist camp might bring Russian and, of course, Chinese involvement, but particularly Russian involvement. The Russians had once been involved in Laos and Southeast Asia, and it almost came to a shooting war. It was in 1960 in the Laotian crisis, when the Russians had a large-scale airlift going from Hanoi to Vientiane. The Air Force and the Navy, being farther to the right, took the position that the hell with the Russians. I mean, you got to stand up to them. You see, the McNamara program was détente and parity of weapons with the Russians. And the Air Force Navy program always was superiority. Those of you who are interested in military politics in America, read the testimony in the Senate committee, like Clark Clifford's, and the key word superiority, that we, the United States, must have military superiority over the Russians. The word superiority is simply a typical American euphemism for arms race. If you use the word superiority, it means you're in favor of another arms race with the Russians. So the Air Force and Navy said, we don't care. Now, the thing that was common to both programs, both strategies, even though they were quite clearly in contradiction, was that both were propagandized as quick, cheap, easy ways of winning the war. That is to say, McNamara said, well, the war may go on for a long time, but through counterinsurgency, theories that have been evolved through the use of the finest brain power in the United States, all the brain power of think tanks like RAND and Institute of Defense Analysis, not to mention university academics who cooperated to develop programs of counterinsurgency, plus all sorts of other brain power available, that with what essentially are what I would call gimmicks, that you could fight a quick, easy, and cheap, not necessarily quick, at least an easy and a cheap war. A counterinsurgency would be able to do with maybe $100 million what normal military efforts would demand billions and billions of dollars. In fact, until 1964, or 65 rather, the Vietnam War was a pretty cheap affair. It didn't cost very much in terms of the overall monetary resources of the American government. But the Navy and the Air Force also made a similar argument. And this is what will lead me into the North Vietnam side of the thing. General Power, who was Chief of Air Force, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, wrote a book in 1964, actually wrote it perhaps in late 63, in which he said, well, we ought to undertake a program of graduated bombing in North Vietnam, and we can win the war, quote, within a few days, end quote. Now, those of you who remember the Cuban Missile Crisis may remember all this talk of a quick surgical airstrike to take out the missile sites, the silos, and so on. And the whole thing will be over. Those of you who remember a little farther back, you remember all the talk about using the Air Force at the Bay of Pigs. If only the Air Force had been sent in, why the Cuban armed forces would have been smashed, and the refugees would have gotten back, and now we'd have a good democratic government in Havana. What I'd like to focus on is this notion that somehow with one quick blow, one quick clean blow, you can resolve a situation. The quick surgical use of violence. I might call your attention that that's a philosophy that's not only by no means dead, but that's quite operative even within police forces in the United States, and within the domestic military, and within college campuses. A lot of people have thought that one way you resolve the college situation where you have a disturbance, as at Columbia or Berkeley in earlier periods, this one nice quick show of force of the cops, beat up a couple of heads and imprison the ringleaders, and so on, that then everything will be resolved. The Wall Street Journal had a long ad in Dow Jones, published in Barron's, as a warning to Columbia University and other private universities that they better do just that, otherwise they're going to lose their support. Namely, the moment trouble comes, bring in the cops, root them out, and you'll cut the trouble off at the root. Now, this notion was a very real one, one of the theories that was behind the regular bombing, which started on February 7th, 1965, was that within 3 months, the North Vietnamese could be brought to their knees. Now, I've heard of this 3 months thing first in North Vietnam, but the Vietnamese are incredibly well informed, very hard-headed, and the front people too. Both the DRV and the front people are very hard-headed, very realistic. I mean, they've been too long in this war. So Nguyen Van Dien, the head of the NLF in Hanoi, said to me that the theory was that within 3 months you could bring Hanoi to its knees. And in early May 1965, there was a bombing pause of 5 days or something like that, and Rusk waited for the response from Hanoi. The response, of course, being a genuflection to the Stars and Stripes, saying, we throw in the towel. Well, I noted this down in my notes. I did lots of other things they told me, and I followed the Vietnam War very carefully, and lo and behold, I found that confirmed when I came back in a series of articles on Operation Marigold and so on. The 3-month theory, which I'd never seen before. Maybe people knew it in Washington, or rumored it, but that this was the basis of the February 7th bombing. That you escalate very rapidly, and the escalation went up very fast. Now, what's quite obvious is that both the McNamara strategy and the Air Force and Navy strategy have just not only failed, they're nothing. They've evaporated in thin air. There was no quick, easy victory in South Vietnam, as is quite obvious. Counterinsurgency is just down the toilet, as is pacification, as is exfiltration, as is special forces, as will be most of the Green Berets in short. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is the air war over North Vietnam. The results of that air war have been exceedingly surprising. In fact, it was suggested in Hanoi, in a number of places, that the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam might consider giving a medal to the U.S. Air Force. But not only have those strategies failed, but the war has turned into precisely what it wasn't supposed to turn into. That it turned into a massive involvement on the Asian mainland, where, for a variety of international and diplomatic reasons, they haven't used nuclear war. Now, the dropping of nuclear weapons is the beginning of World War III. I don't think anyone should have any questions about that. One tiny little nuclear bomb dropped in Quezon, that's World War III. And it's quite clear that the wild men in Washington were not quite that wild. Maybe they were, and got calmed down by other realities. So here you have a typical never again kind of war, under even worse conditions than in Korea. So it was even a great failure in that sense. I'd just like to add one further kind of parenthetical comment along those lines, namely that when people do talk about quick surgical strikes and the use of measured response, or whatever these nice euphemistic terms are, whether it's internationally or at a local level, domestically in the United States. What the Vietnam example and similar examples domestically show, that the probability of this kind of measured application of force leading to a massive and long-range application of force is very high. In other words, if we're going to have riots, more riots this summer, and we have a measured application of force in the ghettos, the chances of permanent guerrilla warfare developing in our cities is very high. I suggest this is one of the lessons we might ponder from Vietnam. There, I think, are reasons for that, but that's again another subject. Now let me get to North Vietnam. I'd be quite happy to answer questions about how I got there and why I went and so on in the discussion period. But let me say a couple of things on the trip. When I was in Phnom Penh getting my visa, spent a fair amount of time in the North Vietnamese embassy and talking to people there. And so the usual question was, well, what's North Vietnam like? Well, the guy smiled and he says, well, you'll see, vous verrez. All the people French there. He said, well, I'll tell you one thing. When you get into the airport, you'll see that the lights are on in the city. We have no blackouts in North Vietnam. And he said, and you will then understand why we leave the lights on. I sort of saw it as a kind of defiance. I also saw it, of course, as a manifestation of their ability to keep the electricity working despite incredibly intensive bombardment of all industrial facilities. Every industrial facility has been reduced to ashes in North Vietnam. But I also eventually realized what he was saying about the air war. That despite 3 years of the most intense bombardment in the history of mankind, that the North Vietnamese have developed an attitude, and when I say develop, this is not something you can simply develop in your mind, but that comes over a period of time, that we're not going to let the air raids, however intensive and however frequent they are, determine our lives. The air raids are to be seen as a temporary deviation from what we do. Maybe I can illustrate that there was a famous French film that was done a number of years ago called Dr. Knopper, The Triumph of Medicine. And there was a discussion between two doctors on their relative philosophies of medicine. And the old-fashioned doctor said, well, his philosophy was that sickness was a temporary deviation from health. And the unscrupulous doctor, who managed to convince a healthy village that they were all sick, said, no, doctor, you're wrong. That the real philosophy is that health is a temporary deviation from sickness. Now, the North Vietnamese have taken the former attitude quite clearly toward the air raids. In other words, it's clearly, if you're living under a rain of bombs every day, you can be traumatized by this and orient your whole life around that. But they said, no, the air raids, no matter how intense and how costly, how destructive of life and property, are a temporary deviation from what is our real life, and our real life is our own war effort, our own production, our own survival. Now, when you come to Hanoi, there's only one airport that hasn't been bombed, the international airport. I suppose simply because the United States still feels it's of some value, or then was of some value, that international planes, there are only two. There's the ICC plane that goes from Phnom Penh, International Control Commission, and the Chinese plane that goes from China. Otherwise, it's the least populated airport in the world. What you see in North Vietnam itself, the very center of Hanoi has not been bombed, except a couple of accidental bombs. Well, excuse me, I don't know if they're accidental, but it did turn out that the Chinese and Cuban embassies were bombed. There's a second periphery of residential houses that's been sporadically bombed. That is to say, there's a lot of damage here, and then rows of houses not damaged, and a lot of damage there, and so on. They're all in residential areas. The suburbs have been just about completely destroyed. And as soon as you get outside of Hanoi, except for Hai Phong, again, that one small port area, everything's been bombed. It's not to say that you don't see houses that are standing, but there are houses standing next to the houses destroyed. All big buildings, almost without exception, have been bombed. There are craters all over the place. So that the question of, the whole question of, bombing military targets, that's just nonsense. I mean, it doesn't even have to be argued. Harrison Salisbury put that nonsense to rest. That there aren't that many military targets in North Vietnam, and I'll explain why in a moment. fact of the matter is that those pilots, they just drop their bombs wherever they want to. They may have certain assigned missions. Very often the target for the whole squadron of planes will be a small 100-foot bridge. Or it'll be, as I say, there aren't that many buildings left, large buildings in North Vietnam. Then they just sort of drop the bombs on their way back. The plane can't land with bombs, and they don't drop them in the ocean. And since 80% of the flights originate from Thailand, there's no ocean for the bombs to be dropped in, so they're just sort of dropped wherever they come. This, I think, simply has made explicit a notion which one finds discussed, was discussed last year, and came a little bit in the open, but again not widely publicized. Again, the differing philosophies of bombing between McNamara and the Air Force. McNamara, as you may remember, took the position that the function of bombing is to interdict infiltration or to interdict supplies. In other words, that bombing should have a rational purpose. And the military replied that the purpose of bombing is to, quote, break the will of the enemy. Now that was spelled out in an Air Force manual quite clearly, that one of the main purposes of bombing is to break the psychosocial structure of the people, and to demoralize a population. That clearly was the aim of the firebombing in World War II on the cities of Europe and Japan, was clearly the aim during the Korean War. And in fact, that has been essentially the bombing philosophy of the military in the United States. That the purpose is to demoralize, to break the psychosocial structure of a population. I'd like to suggest here there's probably one place in the world now where this has succeeded, and that's in Saigon in a way, where the American Air Force has leveled whole sections of the city, largely because there were a couple of Viet Cong guerrillas shooting from the windows. There's a Viet Cong guerrilla, you level a whole block of houses. And they, as they put it in South Vietnamese, American South Vietnamese terminology, they've, quote, generated a large number of refugees. And just a couple of days ago, I saw in the New York Times an item where the U.S. military was suddenly realizing that these new refugees, 100,000 alone, over 100,000 were generated just in the last 3 weeks, not even counting the Tet Offensive. They're kind of worried about those because they're coming to the center of Saigon, and there might be VC agents in there, and these people are a source of disorder. So maybe one might think of commending the Air Force that its theory has been borne out in one area, that they have helped to break the psychosocial structure of the urban population of South Vietnam. Now, when you travel in North Vietnam, when the bombing is on, it's pretty hard to travel at night, and there are air raid alerts. Attacks are quite frequent. Jump into a hole and you wait, and you go out and get back in the car and you move elsewhere. When you travel, there's one absolutely remarkable thing that you see, and I think apparent to anyone who's there, particularly in the countryside, and particularly in the areas that have been heavily bombed, and that is the very evident physical and psychological health of the people. When you go to a village, poor villages, as are in Asian terms, people are poorly clothed. I mean, they're adequately clothed but shabby. The textiles are not in good abundance. The surprising thing is to see kids and even old people with full cheeks, healthy faces, strong bodies, a lot of activity. Peasants, I've seen a lot of Asian peasants being in the field, but peasants with meat on their arms and their legs. That, to my mind, was the most, that of course is physical health. When I say psychological health, I mean an alertness and a kind of general quickness of the spirit. In fact, I even in a country as highly developed as Japan or in certain peasant areas of Europe, I haven't seen that kind of quickness among people. They move fast and they talk and they smile quickly. It's a very remarkable thing. Now, what this, when you see this, interestingly, I might say, I felt that the people who looked worst in North Vietnam were the people in that very central part of Hanoi which had never been bombed. I have a feeling that that's a kind of a disease which we might call bureaucratitis. They work in government offices there, and they did look harried and, physically looked okay. As soon as you somehow got into the bombed areas, people looked a lot better. Now, what this thing that my friend Qua at the North Vietnamese embassy in Phnom Penh said, you will see, this became clear to me. I had expected to see a country somewhat like a punch-drunk fighter in the 14th round. I mean, he's held on, a little guy who's held on against the biggest boxer and, 250-pound giant with muscles of iron. And he's held on to the 14th round, and maybe he can hold on to the 15th round. But to see, not that this country had just survived, but that it actually had grown physically, mentally, and in production terms too, and rather obviously militarily, was the shock. Something that I would never believe unless I'd seen it. I mean, I'm very pro-Vietnamese. There's no, flatly, I want the United States to lose in South Vietnam. I mean, I felt that way earlier, and I feel that way now. But even then, being a kind of social scientist, if someone had said to me, well, or if I'd taken literally what I read in the Vietnam Courier, well, I didn't take that literally. It's just propaganda, I mean, it's just nonsense. I'll go and see for myself. I don't care what shape they're in. I think their cause is just. So this came as a real shock, being taken aback by this. Now, I'd like to say what I think has happened here. I don't know, but I think that in 1965 there was a very acrimonious debate going on among the leaders of North Vietnam of how do you respond to this sudden American escalation of the war. Suddenly bombs are raining down on you in enormous quantities. What are you going to do? There's no question in my mind that in 65 and a large part of 66 the Vietnamese were reeling. I mean, suddenly this hammer blow came. They themselves admit this, and they say that they began to win only a little over a year ago, beginning of early last spring, the time of Operation Junction City, which was an American defeat and a Vietnamese victory. But they admit in 65 they were in bad shape. The argument, which I suspect, from reading the literature, is that one group said the only way to do this is to really tighten the reins. Keep control of the whole situation. Maintain a centralized control. Don't let, there are infiltrators coming in from the south, and there are bombs and so on. Keep tight control and fight that way. And another group argued for decentralization and said, no, the time has come now to really decentralize and to shift power down to local areas and go back to not a guerrilla war struggle, but a guerrilla-type situation. And in particular, I think the key issue over which the problem was fought was a question of whether you should distribute arms to the people. That's obviously a very serious question in any country. And the centralizers said, no, you've got to keep the guns centralized. And the decentralizers, who I think were largely supported by the Vietnamese army, the DRV, said distribute the guns to the people. The decentralizers won. They went back to a guerrilla situation, and they distributed arms to the people, which is most evident I mean, everybody's got his rifle, everybody's got his gun. In fact, it's particularly kind of nice to see these very pretty girls, Vietnamese women, some of the most beautiful in the world, with their rifles, you know, and walking down the street and or in the fields and so on. The thing was a smashing success. And Pham Van Dong obviously didn't allude to, in his conversation with me and discussions of the sort that they had within their own party, but he said, "Notre peuple c'est une merveille." He said, "Our people, they're a miracle, they're a wonder." That the thing worked fantastically. I mean, the whole population obviously, clearly, has not only risen in support, but has actually, on a kind of guerrilla basis, on a sort of a local community basis, if you will, undertaken, in a very disciplined fashion, undertaken the task of keeping the production front going, supporting the fighters in the south, keeping communication going, manning this very extensive air raid warning system, and shooting down planes. Shooting down planes, by the way, I think has been very interesting. I was told that American planes used to machine gun the roads rather regularly. You know, you drop your bombs, and a lot of these guys are sort of Terry and the Pirates types. So why not just zap up a road or two, you know? Well, they did that in 65 and 66, but then the machine gun fire from and small arms fire from the militia was so intense, they brought a lot of these guys down. And, you know, if you machine gun a road in the daytime, you can do it at night too, I suppose, but there's no military traffic during the day. It all goes at night. So the machine gun fire was so intense, they brought a lot of them down. There is no more, or very little machine gunning now. They don't go down that low any longer. They stay up. They stay higher up, or don't fly slowly enough in order to shoot effectively. Now that they've attributed to the militia. Now if I could say a very brief word, time is moving on, I want to talk about Paris too. That the North Vietnamese military force consists of three types. There's a regular army, which presumably does a large part of the fighting in the northern part of the South Vietnam, and which is tied in with the war in the South. There's something they call the shock brigades, which is the most heroic thing you can do. All the young kids volunteer for the shock brigades because they're the ones who do the dangerous work of defusing bombs, particularly defusing delayed action bombs. The Americans have dropped a lot of delayed action bombs that may explode an hour or a day or even a week later. Of course, it's very bad because people go back to the fields and suddenly these things go off. They've developed a kind of science of defusing these bombs and locating them. Then you have the militia, which is the local armed. Every community has its armed military power. They've all got their own rifles, all machine guns, small-scale anti-aircraft weaponry. But it's a local armed force, and it's the armed counterpart of a similarly decentralized administration. The militia plays an enormously important role in North Vietnam. It's like a local police force, locally maintained, locally equipped, well, except for the guns, which they, of course, get from central sources. Now, there are three principles that the Vietnamese have used, the North Vietnamese have used in fighting this war, or this war of resistance against bombing. The words are my own, but or two of them are theirs. I guess they're all their terms too. But this is the way they explained it to me. Principle of dispersal, the principle of evacuation, principle of decentralization. Now, dispersal is kind of obvious. It's the notion that there must be no concentration of people or material in any place. Everything has to be scattered. I'll give one example here. In the case of industry, that every factory has been bombed. Pham and Dong said they're all been reduced to ashes. So they've a lot of the factories. In fact, even before they were bombed, machinery was taken out to the countryside and put underground. But in being put underground, it was all broken up. That is to say, if there was a large textile factory, it was broken up into 7 or 8 parts. schools, all the schools have been, there are no students in Hanoi any longer. They're all evacuated. Polytechnic, beautiful building, partially destroyed. Completely empty, of course. But it's been broken up into about 20 sections, all widely scattered. So everything is dispersed. I had a personal experience. Once there was an air attack not very far when driving, of course, and jumped out and had to get into a hole. And sometimes you have to spend an hour or so in one of those holes. And my friend Von, who was with me, I said, come on, let's at least talk. He said, no. He said, I have to go to another hole. So he went to another hole. And then later he came back and gave me a stern lecture about ça c'était contre les principes. You were violating the principle of dispersal. He said, if we've been hit, better that only one of us has been killed or wounded than all of us. But he gave me a nice little lecture on what this meant. And he said, this is the way, one of the key ways in which we resisted this whole air war. Always dispersal. As soon as planes comes, you split in different directions. The second phenomenon is much more extraordinary and interesting one which I really like to write on. It's hard to write just from 19 or 20 days of experience. So I'd like to do a little bit of research, and that is that the evacuation of a city population to the countryside. Hanoi is I suppose people are coming back now. The bombing has ended. But while I was there, the city was, except for necessary personnel, completely evacuated. Students, officials, children, all out in the rural areas. And in the villages, either next to the villages in straw huts. In fact, they said that what we have now is a society and a government of straw huts, gouvernement et société de paillotes. That's somebody would point out a peasant hut. He said that's the local branch of the health ministry or the provincial health administration. The whole thing has been put out in the countryside. Now, without going more into detail, what the North Vietnamese have achieved here is something that every underdeveloped country has been trying to achieve for decades. Is how to shorten that gap between city and country people. I mean, India has a surfeit of students sitting around in Calcutta. They ought to be out in the villages teaching the peasants, but you can't get them out there, China's had problems. It's done, of course, 1,000 times better than India, 1,000,000 times better than India in this respect. But it's an enormous problem. It takes a lot to do. Now, the war has done it. And the mutual benefits are extraordinary. The benefit for the peasants are obvious. The country is 100% illiterate, or maybe 98%. And the last step forward in literacy was taken with the war. All the teachers are out there, and they spend part of their spare time teaching the peasants how to read. The peasant kids are in with the city kids. The health thing, by the way, very extraordinary. The health thing is quite amazing. I saw Averell Harriman in Washington talk to my impression of North Vietnam. Collingwood had been in there to talk to him. Apparently, Collingwood impressed Harriman with the North Vietnamese health system. So the first question he asked me was about the North Vietnamese health system, and I thought I could make my point that the North Vietnamese are negotiating some strength by telling him something about the health system. I had a number of talks and stuff like in hospitals and so on. I think he was impressed. He's a good man, Harriman. I liked him. But the health and the sanitation is remarkable. I mean, I hate to talk in superlatives, but it's true. You got a country that, like several times, the weather was very bad, and the peasant village is a sea of mud. Yet, despite that mud, the houses are swept clean. There's no garbage. There's no smell. An Asian village stinks to high heaven. Normally, it's just everything well kept. You're going to a door, they say, well, let's say hello to peasant Dawn and so on. And there he is. He's looking pretty good, Old people as well as young. The young people look good in all communist countries. I mean, that's the sort of thing. But to see old people, look well too is very remarkable, So the health thing, and they also went into details to explain how they built this, how they did this. They have a really very interesting system of how you start with only a few doctors and how you proliferate them into thousands and do it effectively. It's a very interesting, fascinating system, and which, well, I won't go into it now, but it's maybe another lecture. The other thing is the decentralization, which I can't go, again, I want to get on to the Paris negotiations. But you have a real administrative decentralization. A considerable amount of decision-making power has been transferred downward to the provinces for the rather simple reason that when you're in a war, changes are frequent, to put it mildly. A bomb drops and the whole road is cut off, you know. A war is not routine. You can't refer decisions, even important decisions, back to the center. Even decisions on military equipment. So they took the risk of decentralization, and it worked. Let me end this section here and try and go on to my next section, which leads to the Paris talks. And this goes beyond North Vietnam and to the very extensive discussions they had with people, with front people and DRB people, on the situation in South Vietnam. Now, the Vietnamese, before the Johnson speech, I was there the day of the Johnson speech, which happened to be April Fool's Day in Hanoi, although it was March 31st in the United States. And most of the discussions, in fact, just about all of them, were before then. And they presented an analysis of the world situation. And their analysis, on the basis of which they based their policies, which consisted of the following, in that order of priority. And this, I heard pretty much the same, when I say same, not party line fashion. The interesting thing is that they're very individually different, and everybody puts a different emphasis. But by and large, more than by and large, these were the three things they pointed out. First, not even before you get to one, that the whole question of survivability of North Vietnam wasn't even discussed anymore. Nobody mentioned it. I mean, it's so obvious. And of course what they were saying here, we don't give a damn whether you increase the bombing or not. You may use nuclear weapons, and that's a different story, you know. That's something we can't do anything about. But bomb us to hell. Bomb us more. Finish destroying Hanoi and Haiphong. Doesn't matter. And they also pointed out that even in the Panhandle, where the bombing is incredibly intense, and it's so intense now, that life goes on in the Panhandle, and the situation there obviously more difficult than it is in the rest of North Vietnam, but not substantially different. Factor number one is that military the Americans have lost in South Vietnam. Now, in general, factor number one was the military political situation in South Vietnam. If I can summarize their analysis in simple, in rather terse terms, the turning point of the war came a year ago in Operation Junction City, which is the biggest attempt by the Americans to clear out a whole province, the province of Haining, in the west, on the Cambodian border, which failed. Enormous cost to the United States, loss of money and material. Gradually, the initiative which the Americans had held since 1965 was lost to them and passed to the Vietnamese. The crowning thing, of course, was the Tet Offensive, which they said, which they anticipated to be the first of a whole series of attacks on the cities. They said, you know, we didn't expect to take the cities for the rather simple reason that we weren't used to city fighting, you know. But the general uprising, which occurred, and I'll explain what they meant about that in a moment, was so successful that they were able to penetrate the cities and remain there far longer than they thought and set up the basis for what's happening now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Continued series of jabs at the city. In other words, they were moving into the final stage, actually attacking the cities. Now, from a purely military point of view, aside, they said the achievement, not just of the Tet Offensive, but everything that had been leading up to it, ever since Junction City, was that the South Vietnamese, except for a few elite groups, are not a fighting force any longer. They've destroyed the South Vietnamese army. That the Americans have been doing the offensive battles all along anyway for a long time, but the South Vietnamese were supposed to man the defensive perimeters around the cities. In other words, to keep the VC from coming in. They smashed all the defensive perimeters around the cities. Every city is an open city, not just Hue and Saigon, but Con Tum and everything else. And that the South Vietnamese military just crumbled. And that the defensive perimeters no longer exist. Now, they say rather frankly, clearly, that we are only fighting one enemy today, the Americans, one military enemy, at the Americans, and their few allies, Koreans, and a few remnant sort of South Vietnamese forces. I personally think they're correct in that. If you remember just in the recent Battle of Saigon, it started off with a lot of propaganda that the South Vietnamese were doing the fighting. That was on the first day of the recent offensive. And then the last day, it turns out that the Americans were doing all the fighting in Saigon itself, with rather minimal South Vietnamese participation. That's one major thing. The second was the smashing of the defensive perimeters, and the third was the general uprising. The general uprising for them, and that was the real purpose of the Tet Offensive, was to do in the cities what they'd done in the villages, to organize military political committee, little ones, I don't mean thousands of people, but 4 or 5 people in each section of Saigon, who then became a guerrilla nucleus within the cities. That is to say, they became the nucleus of armed cadres who then would act in conjunction with the regular military forces of the National Liberation Front to continue the offensive of the cities, and during non-military periods to carry on political work. And political work consists of rather simple administrative tasks, like assuring food for the population, helping the population dig defenses against air attacks, and that, of course, you have to do now in the South Vietnamese city. American planes are bombing your homes just as they're doing in North Vietnam, and carrying out other administrative tasks. There they said that their success was far greater than they anticipated. I mean, the number of these military political committees that were formed were a very considerable number. Proof of that, of course, was the brutal reaction of the Americans, who in South Vietnam, in the cities, whether it was to save lives and not go in house-to-house fighting, for whatever reason, have bombed and destroyed large sections of the major cities of South Vietnam. In fact, some cities, like Ben Che and so on, have just been leveled to the ground during the Tet Offensive. In other words, the Vietnamese see the American reaction, which they did not expect, as a testimony to the extent of their success in having achieved these things. Politically, they write off the South Vietnamese government as a head without a body. And they don't even talk much about the South Vietnamese government any longer. I mean, they say, you know, they call them les fantoches, the puppets. And their feeling is that once they're just people hanging from strings. Obviously, the Americans are pulling the strings, and so the whole feeling is that they've, for all practical purposes, eliminated a South Vietnamese government and army from the scene, and that they're dealing with the Americans. The second factor the first factor they mentioned in this thing thus was the military political situation in South Vietnam. That is the number one thing for them. That's the number one reality. What is happening in South Vietnam, militarily and politically? Two was what they call the balance of forces in the world. And here they emphasized two things which they felt were adverse to the United States and favorable to the Vietnamese. One was the gold crisis. I brought them a lot of clippings from the Wall Street Journal. They'd read them all. You know, we said, we've seen that, you know. In fact, they asked me to give a little bit of a lecture on the gold crisis. I had to pull together my meager economic knowledge. The other was the Pueblo crisis, which they felt showed the incapability of America, that America had not enough strategic reserves to respond to other Vietnams. And it's quite true. Apparently the disposable divisions capable of being airlifted from the continental United States to Korea were exceedingly limited. They gave me the figure, and I discovered later they were correct. But they just read it somewhere in the papers. I mean, you know, there is a lot of this information around. So that's what they call the balance of forces in the world, the economic crisis. 3, world and American public opinion. They felt there was a decisive shift, except for the client states in Southeast Asia, that all governments had really swung against the United States in this war. In Europe, even the Japanese were not that turned down by the Sato government, which employed the slavers in the United States. But obviously, you know, Western Europe and so on. And not to mention the tide in public opinion in America. They were very aware of the McCarthy campaign. They had the percentage figures in Wisconsin down quite in great detail. Now, I would say here that the Vietnamese made a decision that after the Tet Offensive, having made this analysis of these 3 factors, that the time had come to talk. Now, a lot of people have asked me, why talk? Why not just fight the war to a victory? Give you 2 reasons that they cited. They didn't say they were ready to talk, but they put down before the speech. They kept on saying, well, the situation is turning in our favor. But 2 things that they indicated, which made quite clear why they wanted to talk. One, that the only way the United States could recoup its losses, like a gambler who has gone many, many thousands of dollars into debt, not just by putting up another $50, but by putting up another enormous sum. In other words, in order to recoup its losses, the United States would have to mount a major, major escalation. A major, major escalation. Not just a little bit more bombing, not just a few more troops, but a major, major escalation, which would internationalize the war. That's to say, bring the Chinese in. And the Vietnamese made clear that they do not have an interest in World War III breaking out. They quite said, look, we don't want Vietnam to become a sideshow in a larger world war. That's because then we want Saigon, we want South Vietnam, we're Vietnamese, intensely nationalistic people. We don't give a damn about Laos, we don't give a damn about, except as it concerns our national security. And they never even mentioned Thailand, weren't even interested in Thailand. But quite clear, they felt that Johnson was facing this choice. And you probably know already, but I can say from my own research that is exactly what was being pondered earlier this year. Don't forget all the talk at the time of Keishang and so on about using nuclear weapons. That was pondered at the time. A big major escalation. And Rusk, you know, was a kind of barometer of thinking, suddenly bringing up the yellow peril again and all these billions of Chinese that are ready to pour over Waikiki Beach and Muscle Beach here in Santa Monica. So that was being pondered, and they knew it. They knew it perfectly well. The second thing they said, that even if things go very well with us, and this is what Montana from the Liberation Front said, we can never push the Americans in the ocean. We've defeated them militarily. They haven't, I mean, this is nonsense, I think, when people say, you know, that the Viet Cong have lost every battle. It's just crap. I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, you know, who knows what a victory is and so on. I mean, you know, but they claim that in all of these battles that have gone on, that bit by bit, it is they who've taken the initiative, they who pushed the Americans back, and in fact, they who pushed the Americans into enclaves. The Americans are in enclaves today. I leave my own remarks in this case out, but I'm going to say something about the A Shau Valley. But we can't push the Americans into the ocean. They can sit in Chu Lai and Cu Chi and Da Nang for 100 years. They can keep their 50 Guantanamos, and there's nothing we can do about it. Quite clear. Obvious. In order to get rid of the Americans, we've got to talk to them. Having beaten them and having beaten their puppets, we now have to talk to them. So I would say these two factors, plus their analysis of the trend of the world situation and everything else, the time has now come, I think, to talk to the Americans. And they did. There obviously was some kind of secret contact. There's no doubt about it. Seems from the story I read in the Times, the Chronicle today, that it was on March 18th, the day I got to Vietnam, that Johnson had a big secret meeting with all kinds of bigwigs and decided that the war was a lost cause and so on. There's no question that some kind of communications were going on. All right. Now, I'll end here very quickly. The talks have now taken place, or are taking place. So what are these talks? They're clearly not just a few men sitting around in Paris who are going to outshine each other or outconvince each other with argumentation. I think Harriman is a good man. I had long talks with Hanan Lo, the second Shang-Chi in the Vietnamese delegation. But that's not the important thing. I'm glad they're being very civil to each other. They shake hands, and which was better than it was in the old days. But the Paris talks are nothing in themselves. The Paris talks are, at this point, a reflection, a clear-cut reflection of a real situation in South Vietnam. Paris is only what the reflection of Saigon is. Nothing more and nothing less. Now, the key question, as far as I can see now, and the key real question that is going to determine which way the Paris talks go, is how long the South Vietnamese government can last. The Americans now are doing what they did in Korea under much 1,000 times worse circumstances. During the 2 years of protracted negotiations, desperate efforts were made to shore up the Syngman Rhee government, and it worked. And to shore up the Syngman Rhee army, the ROC army, and it worked. So when peace finally came, we did have a strong South Korea, and the communists couldn't take it any longer. This is, I would say, what's now happening in South Vietnam. It's a desperate military and political effort by Bunker, Westmoreland, et al. to shore up with any crutches, any artificial legs, any flim-flammery that you can, something that is called the South Vietnamese government. Now, this has partly a military aspect, like this famous order to go out and win battles, take the war to the enemy, or the Ashau Valley offensive. Part of it, of course, are these Mutt and Jeff machinations between Thieu and Key. Americans don't quite know whom to back. New Premier Huang is in, and he's supposedly a very nice progressive man, and I mean all these kind of things that are going on. But what it is a desperate rearguard effort to shore this thing up. Now, obviously, the North Vietnamese and